The National Railway Museum is full of characterful engines, from the famous Mallard to the tiny Pet. Among these, 30925 Cheltenham doesn't seem to stand out. Yet this engine, as part of the Schools class, represents the culmination of the 440 design in Britain, and the most powerful of its kind in all of Europe. Cheltenham itself found fame on the cover of the Railway Observer, a spot it occupied for over 3 decades, which helped it survive beyond service. And while most of its preservation has been spent on static display, it only recently retired from a successful decade in steam. This is the story of 925 Cheltenham. In 1928, the Southern Railway's express services were primarily run by the 460 King Arthur and Lord Nelson classes. Due to a restrictive loading gauge, the maximum height and width an engine can be to safely avoid bridges and tunnels, these engines couldn't pull services on the Tunbridge to Hastings line, which was instead run by the 1914 designed L class. Chief Mechanical Engineer Richard Mansell had built a modified version of this design, the L1 class, in 1926, but by 1928 the decision was made to create an entirely new express locomotive. The design was similar to that of the Lord Nelson class, but scaled down to a 440 wheel arrangement. The original Belpaire firebox, a square design that offered better steam distribution, had to be substituted for a round-topped design, both to reduce weight on the driving wheels and allow a greater view from the cab. Despite the effort that went into ensuring they were small enough to run on the Tunbridge to Hastings line, the design ended up too heavy for certain sections of it. The first batch of 15 was reduced to 10 as work was undergone to strengthen parts of the railway, which was still ultimately easier than increasing the loading gauge. The class were all built at Easterley Works, with the first batch each at a cost of £6,092. The engines were designated the V class, and came to be known as the Schools class, due to each locomotive being named after a public school in the region. E900 Eton was the first of the class, completed in March of 1930, with the rest of the batch following the same year. Eton was named at Waterloo Station on the 26th, and put on display at Windsor and Eton Station a few days later. This practice continued, with all members of the first batch being put on display at the station closest to the school they were named after, allowing students, particularly train spotters, to see their engine. The schools were released in the Southern Railway's lined olive green livery, initially running without smoke deflectors, which were added in August the following year. 1931 also saw the railway's numbering system changed to omit lettering, so E900 became just 900. With their intended route still not ready, the schools were first put to work on the Dover to Folkestone line, where they proved to be strong and reliable engines. The class had a pulling power or tractive effort of 25,130 pounds, almost on par with the larger King Arthur class. They were the last engines with a 440 wheel arrangement designed in Britain, and also its most powerful. Under the later British Railways, they were the only of the kind to be given a power classification above 5. Before the class even set a wheel on the Tunbridge to Hastings line, a second batch of 15 engines had been ordered. It was July of 1931 that the schools were finally set to work on the route they had been built for, but they had proved they were suitable for other work. The second batch was allocated to Fratton to run trains from Portsmouth to London's Waterloo Station, and were followed by the third batch. This included 925 Cheltenham, built in April of 1934 at a cost of £5,256. It was in 1936 the engine was given individual importance, as the cover engine for the Railway Observer. This was a magazine distributed to members of the Railway Correspondence and Travel Society, one of the oldest rail enthusiast societies in the UK. But why 925? The society had been formed in Cheltenham, so the engine was chosen to honour the society's legacy, with the locomotive remaining in its place on the magazine's cover until the 1970s. 1937 saw the electrification of the Portsmouth line, so Cheltenham was reallocated to Bournemouth to run trains between it and Waterloo, including the name service, the Bournemouth Limited. This year also saw Oliver Bullard take over the role of CME from Richard Mansell, introducing a new malachite green livery, which 925 was repainted into in 1938. Bullard was the source of most modifications to the class. The largest was the introduction of jet blast pipes, following their success on the Lord Nelson class. They were intended to improve steaming by drawing more air through the smoke box, requiring a larger funnel. But the change had a minor impact on the schools, so only 20 were fitted, with Cheltenham not being given the modification. March of 1938 saw 935 Sevenoaks given the most drastic alteration of the class. To mimic the success of streamlining on the LNER and LMS, 935 was fitted with a streamlined frame made of plywood and renumbered to 999, with its nameplate simply reading Southern. It's clear this alteration wasn't a success, as it was all reverted by the next month, with the engine likely never having left the works in that form. When World War II began, the Southern Railway's trains were the most vulnerable to German bombing raids. 1942 saw the schools class began being outshopped in wartime black, with Cheltenham being repainted in 1943. Also in 1942, number 931 King's Wimbledon was refitted with protective armour around its cab. This experiment was intended to be fitted to over 200 engines, but the restricted space and heat build-up prevented it from getting further than the single locomotive. Engines began being reverted to malachite green in January of 1946, but just after Cheltenham's return to form in 1948, the railways were brought under control of the government with British Railways, requiring a new livery. While passenger engines were intended to be painted into BR green, the schools class saw themselves treated as mixed traffic engines, painted into lined black over the next 2 years, with Railway Observer updating its cover not long after Cheltenham's 1950 repaint. Under the nationalised numbering system, the schools had their numbers increased by 30,000, with 925 becoming 30925. In January, Cheltenham was reallocated to Dover, running on the school's first route, Dover to Folkestone. A multitude of locomotive transfers occurred in the region in May of 1951, with 30925 moving to Bricklayers Arms Depot, running trains out of London. This period would see Cheltenham pull the Wessex Wyvern, its first rail tour for the Railway Correspondence and Travel Society. Held on the 8th of July 1956, Cheltenham pulled the first leg of the journey, going from Waterloo to Brockenhurst. The year after would see the Western region begin repainting a number of BR Black passenger engines into green. The Southern region followed its example, with Cheltenham being given a more appropriate BR passenger green livery in 1960. But, by the following year, the end was closing in on the schools class. Withdrawals began with 30919 Harrow and 30932 Blundells, and Cheltenham saw itself briefly move to Stewart's Lane in February, before being transferred again to Basingstoke in August. The engine would go further afield, however, in May of 1962, when chartered for another RCTS rail tour. Held on the 13th, the engine was sent to the London Midland region to pull the East Midlander No. 5, double-heading the train with 40646 and LMS 440. The train travelled from Nottingham Victoria to Wetherby and back. Another charter was held on the 7th of October, with Cheltenham pulling the first leg of the Sussex Special, going from London Bridge Station to Brighton. Unfortunately, the class was not to last much longer. By December, only 17 schools remained in service, all of which were withdrawn at the end of the year. Cheltenham had one of the highest mileages of the class, having run 1,127,788 miles in service. Given the class's notable strength, British Railways saw fit to preserve a member of the class in the National Collection. Normally, the Premier engine would be used, but 30900 Eton had been modified with Bulledge jet blast pipe, and a locomotive built to the original design was wanted. Given it hadn't been altered, and with some input from the RCTS, the decision was made to have Cheltenham preserved. Of the 40 schools built, 3 total were preserved, all from the third batch, and all sharing shed allocations in their working life. 926 Repton was sold overseas, being displayed at Steamtown USA in Vermont, with an American cowcatcher, bell and headlamp. The other engine, 928 Stowe, was put on static display at the National Motor Museum in Bewley. Cheltenham, meanwhile, returned to Fratton, being stored in a shed there alongside 7 other preserved engines. In September 1964, it was sent to Stratford Works, and February 1968 saw it moved to Preston Park. By 1970, it was clear BR didn't have any plans for the engine, so it was loaned to the Standard Gauge Steam Trust and moved to Tyseley for restoration. But not much work had been done by the time it was put on static display at the Dinting Railway Centre in 1973. In 1977, the engine was transferred to the National Railway Museum, which had opened 2 years prior. It was finally restored, making an in-steam appearance at the 1980 Rocket 150 Cavalcade, painted in malachite green. However, this ended up as a one-off, and by 1981 the engine was placed on static display in the museum. and this is where it stayed for almost 30 years. But in 2010, a chance came for it to return to the line. It was being removed from the museum to have asbestos still in the engine removed, and initial inspections found it had remained in good condition. The Mid-Hants Railway was approached about possibly loaning out the engine, as another Mansell engine, 850 Lord Nelson, was already running on their rails. Cheltenham was taken to Eastleigh Works for its asbestos removal, the second preserved engine they worked on after Lord Nelson. With the benefit of closer inspection, the decision to return 925 to steam was finalised. Even in good condition, the restoration was faster than expected. By May of 2012, the locomotive was reassembled on the same tracks it had been first built 78 years prior, and was re-steamed for the first time since Rocket 150. The engine's first planned appearance had been in September, but the museum was able to take advantage of the early completion to display Cheltenham at the 2012 Railfest. The locomotive was then brought to the Mid-Hants Railway to wait for their September gala. The original plan for this was to have the Mansell 440 operate alongside the matching 462s, 850 Lord Nelson and 777 Sir Lamiel. However, late in August, the latter locomotive was discovered to be in need of repair, so couldn't attend. The meeting of schools and Sir Arthur classes was not long delayed, however, as Sir Lamiel was back in steam when Cheltenham visited the Great Central Railway for their October-autumn gala. For the following decade, Cheltenham ran primarily on the Mid-Hants, but made regular visits to other heritage lines like the Bluebell Railway. In 2017, the engine suffered its only major issue when a crack was discovered in the frame, which was able to easily be repaired at the railway's workshop. It returned here in 2019, where it was repainted into its as-withdrawn BR green livery. The only notable difference was the colour of the nameplates. One was black while the other was left red, showcasing how schools could be seen wearing either colour in that livery. It worked like this for another 3 years, until 2022, when Cheltenham pulled its last trains at the Mid-Hants Autumn Steam Gala. The locomotive's 10-year boiler certificate had expired, preventing the locomotive from running again until another overhaul. Cheltenham was kept in storage for the next 2 years, during which time its black nameplate was repainted to match its red. Hopes of the engine being given another overhaul were dashed when, in 2024, it was put on static display at the museum's Great Hall in York. Cheltenham may not be the most unique looking engine in the National Railway Museum, but it more than deserves its place there. It was the icon of a significant society for over 30 years and represents the strongest class of 440 locomotives built in Europe. Thanks to everyone who requested this video. Feel free to tell me about your own experiences with Cheltenham, and if there's a locomotive you'd like to see me cover in the future, be sure to suggest it in the comments below.